I am very excited about this next panel. We've never done anything quite like this here at WITA before, turning the tables a bit. The trade reporters are usually in the audience. Sometimes they're moderating our discussions. Both David and Shawn have both been moderators at WITA discussions in the past, I think more than once in each of their cases. But this time the WITA board actually came up with this great idea to sort of have a discussion with the trade reporters. You can find the names of all the WITA board members in your program today. They were all incredibly helpful in putting on today's conference. We've gotten, a lot of people have thanked me for the work that we did here at WITA, but we couldn't do it without the support of our board members who they will tell you I over-communicate, as I guess you all know, because WITA does a bit of over-communicating with all of you, that it's a collaborative effort with the board members, and I hope you get a chance to see some of them. They have these shiny silver name tags. They're around the room today. Very grateful to all of them for their help. And I am especially grateful for, on this panel, Dorothy Dwoskin, a longtime friend. I know most of you in the room probably know Dorothy from her days at USTR and with Microsoft. She's also been a longtime WITA board member and a great supporter and helper for all of us on the WITA staff. We're very grateful to you, Dorothy. We're grateful to all of our speakers for joining us. And with that, we'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
So thank you very much. I hope everybody had a good lunch and everybody's sugar level is back up and ready to have a lively discussion. So this is, as Ken said, a turning the tables kind of discussion, an opportunity to ask the questioners the questions. If you've gone through all of their bios, you'll see that there are some common threads. I didn't know we were going to have a Financial Times journalists reunion up here, but these folks are great in their own right, and it turns out have been colleagues on the beat. So hopefully we'll have a pretty informal discussion. I have some questions to ask, and then we'll turn it over to the audience to ask questions. So one thing I think everybody's trying to figure out is, we're all in a different environment if you're covering trade, either from the business community, active in government, or reporting on it. So let's talk a little bit about how things have changed over the years, particularly, with this administration. Is it easier, harder? What are the things that you're looking for in terms of trying to cover the administration and trade issues? We talked a little bit this morning about some people having differences of opinion in the administration. Is that a good thing, a bad thing, access? Anyway, Shawn, shall we start with you?
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm always uncomfortable when you turn the tables on me. Much more. I've got my notebook out here, Dorothy, so I might fire some questions back at you. I think the first thing that clearly has changed, and I think you've probably all felt this to a certain extent as well, is that trade is suddenly like sexy and cool, and it's about geopolitics, and they want to put it on the front page, and that's all very new. When I started covering trade, it wasn't that long ago, in 2013, but I did it because it was kind of going to be a bit of a break. It was, I'd come off running the foreign desk at the Financial Times, and we'd gone through the Eurozone crisis, the Arab Spring, the 2008 crisis, and I was exhausted. I was looking for something to kind of, recharge my batteries and so on. And the biggest thing going there was the TPP, which was then entering its 25th or something round. And I thought, okay, we got some time to play with here. We can get to some interesting places and ponder some interesting issues. And then, of course, everything changed in 2016. At the same time, it's become a lot more complicated on two fronts. One, I think, and one is the kind of the assumed central argument for trade and American trade policy has been kind of shaken to its core. We have a president who questions the very the status quo that was there for decades. And so that's a fundamental thing, which means that a lot of It's provoked a lot more thinking pieces, a lot more thought about challenging assumptions on trade and so on. I was just in Davos last week. That's like a whole different bubble, and it's having its own existential crisis over there. And part of it is this challenging of trade. The second thing that's challenging is dealing with an administration where there's a diversity of views. There's it's never clear if what you're being told by even sources within the administration, I'm sure some of you have dealt with this as well, is a statement of administration policy, or is a statement of likely direction, or is simply that person's kind of bugbear and trying to push their agenda at that point. It's also, in off-the-record conversation, sometimes a lot more colorful than it was in talking to the Obama administration, which was much more disciplined about some of these things. There's clearly some personal rivalries that people like to air to reporters. So, I mean, the whole world has changed for trade reporters in the last few years.
Gina, you have?
Yeah, well, and just to add on to that, in dealing with this administration, there are obviously, as you all know, various factions who are pushing, one agenda or the other. And so the incoming you get as a reporter following this, where sometimes it's not even you reaching out, they're reaching out to you to try to spin you before the other faction can. And you're sometimes in a position where, and I never thought I would say this to certain high-level government officials, where I'm like, I don't know if you are speaking for the president. And I've had to say that to, certain people at various times, knowing that, they might be saying one thing, but Trump because the markets are down or, something else is going on where he changes his mind and, what's true in 1 minute is not true in the next. And so trying to keep up with that has obviously been a challenge. The other thing I think in the midst of all of this is just trying to remember the big picture of certain policies. These are things that affect, broad swaths of the economy in every sector. So remembering to, talk to farmers in Iowa or Montana or, California, talking to small businesses who so many of them have been hit by particularly the latest tranche of the 301 tariffs, where the 10% rate is on, and they're waiting to see if it goes up to 25%. So many of them came to DC for the first time since they were, a kid coming for a school trip. And so trying to remember that this also affects a lot of people and their livelihoods, and this isn't just sort of a Washington game or something that's being played out between the world's biggest economies. And just lastly, in terms of, again, the different takes by various players in the administration, one of the new things that I think probably all of us have been dealing with is having foreign officials ask us for advice on how to deal with this administration or who they should talk to or what should they do even as part of their negotiating strategy, whether it's, folks from the EU, folks from China and elsewhere. It's been a little disconcerting that, one of their ideas is to ask a journalist what they should be doing, which I think speaks to some of the broader problems.
Thanks.
So I would echo almost all of that. When I think about the difference between today and, say, 10 years ago, before the financial crisis, I think the changes come down to access, pace, and priority. And to take those in reverse orders, this, in terms of priority, as Shawn says, we end up on the front page a lot more than we might have in the past. To the extent that the president has deeply held personal policy beliefs, trade, I think, is the core of his worldview. Right or wrong, he has a view of the world that basically consists of wily foreigners outwitting and screwing Americans. And that's sort of the 30,000-foot view that animates all of his policies, and it's a consistent train of thought for him over 30 years. This is not, many of his views, of course, have gone back and forth, pro-life, pro-choice, what have you, but he's been utterly consistent on trade, and I think he does care about it in that sense. The pace of events, as I mentioned to somebody I was talking to at lunch, since about March of last year when he imposed the steel and aluminum tariffs, it's been a blitzkrieg of work. And again, I'm not complaining because much of it has landed me on the front page, and that's all to the good. But there have been some times when you feel like, geez, I would give anything for a boring presidency just for 30 days if we could just turn off the Twitter machine just briefly. And the other thing I think is striking is that the access to the USTR is much different than was my experience under Sue Schwab, who's here, or Ron Kirk, or Rob Portman. I have done trade off and on long enough to remember when you could actually call the USTR press office and get in to see the chief trade negotiator, either on the record or on background, and get a nice exposition of the administration's view of things and a realistic, if spun, assessment of how things were going to go. And for reasons I think I understand, Ambassador Lighthizer has a much different approach to dealing with the press. I suspect that's good for his internal standing in an administration where the president likes to have the spotlight. But I do think it, as some of my colleagues have said, it makes it difficult to tell what the actual policy is. Who does speak with authority?
So great. So that's the administration. Now we're in a situation where I think a lot of us have had to go to the Hill to actually make our point of view known on things. I was struck back when I was had a different hat on, going to talk to Mr. Brady, who was then chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and he asked us a number of questions, and a number of people around the table said, actually, we really don't know what's going on. And that's why we've come to talk to you. So let's add the Congress into covering the trade agenda and navigating trade politics in D.C. You're going to have changes in the House. Mr. Neal taking over Ways and Means. You have Mr. Hatch, who was one of the big-time supporters of trade and trade agreements, who's not there anymore. How do you see the landscape for navigating trade politics in D.C. with the Congress? Some of you probably spend more time on the Hill than others, but you also have this thing called the 2020 elections. And, there's always a question of how much time do you have to get anything done before the 2020 elections actually make it impossible to do things. USMCA obviously is one such issue. So you have thoughts on that in terms of if you bring the administration into that? I know some of you cover more on the Hill than others. Who wants to go first?
I don't spend a lot of time on the Hill, but I'll go first. Look, I think broadly the politics of trade in the U.S. are really interesting, but I also think they're very different depending on which bit of the trade brief you're talking about. I think the politics of NAFTA, USMCA, I prefer NAFTA, but are very different from those of what's going on with China right now, or even what's going on with the EU right now, and the EU's resistance to talking about agriculture in trade negotiations. But I think broadly, there's also there's two questions for me this year when it comes to the Hill. Is one, is the Hill going to assert itself differently this year than it did last year? Last year it seemed to kind of complain a little bit about the 232 tariffs and so on, but sort of let things slide. We've heard that there's going to be a pushback on 232 this year. Chuck Grassley has talked about that. Let's see how far that actually goes. I clearly am watching what happens with NAFTA, USMCA, whether that actually happens, but my sense is that is as tied up in the broader politics of the opposition Democrats and whether they're willing to give President Trump a win of any kind, as it is in the actual detail of that agreement. I think what happens with China, I think the biggest question, what seems to me the hardest thing that the president has to do is to, if he wants to reach a deal with China, reach a deal that doesn't open himself up to being called weak on China. And we saw that last year in May when there was that quick turnaround when they had agreed to a framework, and people like Rubio and Schumer came out very quickly and accused him of bending over to the Chinese. I think there's and that's also complex. And then in the background is that my question about the broader politics of trade on the ground, and whether, a lot of the polls out there show us this strange phenomenon that suddenly trade is more popular than it's ever been, and that some of the Pew Research shows NAFTA is more popular than it's ever been. So how does that play into 2020? And do we see a proper national debate about trade and its place in the American economy, or does it remain that kind of that third rail that no one wants to touch and no one wants to be for free trade agreements in national politics? I thought the most interesting sign of something that may come was in the Beto O'Rourke race in Texas last year, where you had a progressive Democrat who was pro-trade, pro-NAFTA, and his main and was openly criticizing the president's tariff policy, saying, while I agree with him standing up to China, I disagree with his approach and use of tariffs and so on. If we see that debate translated into the 2020 race, I think that's going to be really interesting.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how the bipartisan consensus for a rethink or an overhaul of the broader U.S. Policy towards China develops. Because I do think the president could find himself attacked as being too soft on China. It's a safe play, I think, for Democrats to make. It's also one that some Republicans will make, because the president has set a very high bar for success. He has talked endlessly about getting the trade deficit down, and he has established that, to the consternation of all economists, as the metric to look at, and yet, it's going through the roof and likely will continue to. And that's an easy thing for an opponent to point to and say, well, hang on, you ran in 2016 saying you would close this gap. Instead, it's only gotten worse. You've talked a good game. You sat down with Xi Jinping, who you call your great friend, and yet you came back with this damp squib of a deal, assuming that's what we end up with in 30 or 60 days. So I think that's going to be problematic for the president. But I also think, we've spent, depending on how you want to run the clock, 30 or 40 years in a largely cooperative relationship with the Chinese with elements of competition. That's now flipping, and it's, naturally the case that as things recalibrate, the system tends to overdo it, and we could well find ourselves, or at least I'll be watching to see if we find ourselves sort of tilting too far in the other direction.
Interesting. Gina, did you have a thought that you wanted to share?
Well, I was just going to say, so I write opinion columns for Reuters, Breakingviews, so I talk to a lot of people on background or off the record, including members of Congress and their staff. And I guess what struck me most last year was just how much fear they had in terms of taking Trump on. Even those who are adamant pro-free traders had a lot of businesses that were being hurt in their districts by either the 232 tariffs or the 301 tariffs on China. And we're talking about, various ideas to possibly put some restrictions on the president, but still being very hesitant to move forward. And a lot of this was before the midterms, and so there was a thought you still needed him for especially some of those close races. I'm waiting to see, especially with the shutdown and how that's ended, if there is more of a sense of wanting to do something, because the 232 tariffs are still around. I mean, even with USMCA and certain things moving forward, the steel tariffs and aluminum tariffs are still having an effect on the auto industry and various others. So, and especially if the president moves forward on the auto tariffs, which I think he still likes the idea of them enough to seriously consider that, that I keep hearing from members, oh, that's when, that will be the red line for us. But I don't know, because at least, especially in the Senate, some of the new members, a lot of them really needed Trump's help to get over the finish line. So, does that affect them? Because they will need probably a veto-proof majority if they do anything to restrict him. So that's one of the things I'm looking for. And as both David and Shawn said, how trade plays out in 2020, especially with so many Senate Democrats running for office. I remember being at the Democratic National Convention in 2016 in Philly, and so many Bernie supporters had these against TPP, the round circle with the cross through it. And I happened to be on a subway with a bunch of them leaving the convention, and I was asking them, why they were against TPP. And the first answer was, what a lot of them say is, it's going to cost American jobs. And when I asked how, they didn't know, really. They didn't have an answer. A lot of them thought China was actually in the TPP. When I explained it's not, they kind of got confused. And so, but it was a really big issue at the DNC. I was surprised at how much it was talked about, and we'll see where its place is in the next race.
So that's interesting. I mean, I think, I know all of you have traveled around the country and sort of talked to people in the real world about what's going on. And we've gone through this phase of tariffs are really good. The president's a tariff man, and we're putting more money in the Treasury, and the whole idea that we need to deal with trade deficits. Is there a chance in the next, time between now and the elections that we can do something to show people that maybe these aren't the right tools, and at least get a little more of the facts out on what the right tools might be for trade, taking on the Pew findings? Is there an opportunity here, or are we just kind of stuck with this debate about trade deficits and tariffs? My model for whether or not I was actually getting through to someone was whether or not I could explain this to my 96-year-old mother. I can't imagine trying to write this every day about. So what are you thinking?
I mean, there's always an opportunity, and we've tried over the past year or so to tell stories about people who are impacted by the tariffs. I did a piece out of Indiana, I think, about a family where, one half of the family was benefiting from the steel tariffs, but the other half of the family was suffering because of the retaliatory tariffs on farm goods, U.S. farm exports. And those stories always do really well, but it's never clear to me. I'd be interested in your thoughts. It's never clear to me whether I'm changing any minds. Mm-hmm. Not that, my objective isn't necessarily to change minds as much as a columnist would, but, we're not the only paper that have written these stories. We've written more than one of them, and they always do quite well in the readership metrics. But I always wonder whether I'm preaching to the choir, whether folks who already were suspicious that tariffs probably aren't a great idea are simply having their views confirmed, because there are still people, and you meet plenty of them, who say, well, he's helping the steel industry, so these tariffs have helped steel, and if the analysis stops there and doesn't consider downstream effects, that snapshot looks good.
Yeah, unfortunately, I feel like for sort of the broader public, especially those who are in favor of the tariffs, to get a sense of, why they might not be working, it will take, unfortunately, a lot of pain. Like, there needs to be headlines of job losses or factories shutting down or whatever. And, it's one of those things where, yes, the tariffs have hurt Ford or GM or others, but frankly, they're not going to be, it's not going to close them down. Caterpillar, Boeing, they're not going to be shut down by it. It's these medium and smaller sized businesses or farmers that can't absorb the cost, can't really pass them on to their customers, make changes to their supply and all of that, that are the ones being hurt. And, to get sort of an aggregate of those for people to start noticing is, unfortunately, I don't know if that's what it will take. I did something, especially because the farmers are one constituency that Trump is really paying attention to, is talking to a lot of them. They are still on board, a lot of them, with the president. They feel like, they have faith in his negotiating abilities, but they obviously are feeling a lot of pain. And so I did something about their financing, and I don't know that much about how that works. I had to learn a lot, but this actually right now, from January to March, is sort of the time period where a lot of them are going to the banks to get financing for their next harvest in the fall. And so how many of them are going to have the amount of funding that they need, given all the uncertainty around the tariffs and whether, they'll have enough cash flow liquidity to pay this back. The Kansas City Fed put out something about how much bankruptcies have gone up just in the upper Midwest in their district, just, over, I think, the 2017-2018 period. So, I think as that also progresses, farmers will start to also question, how long they can sort of keep up their support. And unfortunately, I don't know if it's things like that that will sort of change people's minds.
Tariffs are a little bit easier, I think, than the trade deficit. You mentioned the trade deficit to somebody who doesn't follow economics, and they just kind of look at you like, what are you talking about? I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. On the trade deficit, I think most of the real world views it in the same way that the president does, as some kind of profit and loss statement, right? And then you can start having that conversation about, well, I have a really big trade deficit with my local supermarket and, my barber, and really, I don't. That's incredibly hard to explain. And then, when you get into, the macroeconomic effects and so on, I don't think anyone's ever going to win that battle.
Yeah.
I think the only way that battle gets won is when you get, the problem is trade data and the way it's counted in the world today is broken.
Right.
And so we don't account for a huge segment of the population in terms of digital transactions or data flows, or we don't, we still have questions about whether we're measuring services correctly, and then get into the value added in goods. The famous iPhone example, which you're all familiar with. And then the question of multinational profits in foreign countries and how those fund headquarter jobs. It's all just a lot messier. But the trade deficit is easy to latch onto. I think the tariff story is. I think there's been. I remember back in April, was it when the 232s were first launched? I remember someone fairly senior in the trade community here in Washington saying, well, damn it, let's do it, because we need to relearn again all the lessons we've learned in the past and forgotten. And we need to get that pain through the system again, just so people remember just what bad policy tariffs are. And which is it's a cynical view of it, but to a certain extent, I think that's playing out. Headline today, Harley Davidson, its profits in the fourth quarter were basically wiped out by tariff costs. We've seen the story of it relocating some of its production overseas to avoid European retaliatory tariffs. We've seen the GM story come through. This stuff, and it's only just starting to creep in. The economic effect is only starting to creep through, and even the earnings effect is only, we're 2 quarters in, really. the CBO yesterday putting out a report in which it was saying it was clearly negative. Some of the pro-tariff crowd on Twitter, where I sometimes hang out, saying, saying, well, they said the negative impact wasn't that bad, so of the tariffs. So I think there's a recalibrating of expectations. Another, sort of real-world example. I was on a plane out. I think I was heading out to Kansas at some point last year, and minding my own business, waiting under my seat, and on comes the late arrival, the guy who's been holding up the flight, gets on, sits down next to me. He's had a couple. And I don't identify myself. I just kind of shrink into my seat and say, I've got a couple hours on the plane next to this guy. Let's just not cause any trouble. He's bigger than me. And he looks out the window and he spots a German military plane. This is at Dulles on the tarmac. He says, I bet they're coming over here to talk about the tariffs. I'd never identified myself as a trade reporter at this point, and so on. And he says, boy, that's some crazy business. The kids, what are they going to think when they read about this in the history books, huh? We're pretty damn stupid. And this was kind of completely unprompted. This did not appear to be one of you guys, as far as I could tell. Someone who had a kind of, trade in the portfolio. This was a regular John who'd had a couple of beers and was commenting on life in America today. And I think you hear, more and more of that. Over Thanksgiving, my mother-in-law was asking about tariffs and whether I thought they were a good idea. I said probably not, and then she asked me why, and I tried to move on because everyone else was bored. But it was kind of, it's kind of seeped into the conversation in a way, and it will continue to in a much bigger way as the economic pain continues. The advantage that Trump had last year was a huge one in that he had a booming economy that was juiced by the tax cuts and so on. And any short-term impact, and you would hear this from people in the White House, any short-term negative impact they felt that they could manage because the economy was so strong. That story's kind of changed. And now there's a building story of economic mismanagement by this presidency, and tariffs are part of that, and that will feed into 2020, and it's one of the reasons why he probably wants to get a deal soon on China so he can put it behind him.
Did you?
No, I was just going to make a similar point, which is that these stories, I think, will get more traction as the economic and political landscape changes, because when the economy's booming, complaints about tariffs seem like niggling around the margins. But in a weak economy, that looks like a potential cause. And likewise, when the president is, laying waste to everything before him, he's a strong political figure, as Gina says. Republicans don't want to challenge him, but, despite what apparently the White House thinks, it's not obvious that he covered himself with glory in his handling of the government shutdown, and those sorts of episodes start to free up people to take him on.
So let's talk a little bit more about China and the fact that everybody's interested in what Liu He is going to do for the next 2 days. In terms of sort of setting expectations and sort of pacing the reporting on this, what should we be looking for in terms of signs and signals? And if you have some comments on how the Chinese and the U.S. side have both managed their external communication strategy. I asked this question because I was talking to somebody who's a former trade negotiator, and we were watching what was going to happen when the Americans went to China, and Liu He managed to just come into the room. And this person said, I had this list of different things to look for, like who's going to be there and all these things. So as a negotiator, there are things we look for. But for reporters, what are you guys looking for in terms of signals that something's going to happen? And we won't hold you to it. we've all been wrong. So
Yeah, I mean, I try not to overthink this stuff. I mean, we're still 30 days, as Mnuchin said yesterday. You know, I think some people, even in my newsroom, got ahead of themselves a little bit with the make or break nature of these 2 days. Are they going to get a deal? They're not going to wrap up a deal, Thursday. So I think the best case is they come out of it with Lighthizer making reasonably positive noises about progress, and the worst case is Lighthizer comes out of it saying, the Chinese still don't get it. They won't make appropriate representations on the structural issues. But I don't think that's either time. That's not a white smoke, black smoke, papal moment. There's still 30 days to go before this thing really comes down to a crunch. And if I were going to bet money, I think it goes beyond March 1st, because I suspect the president, as the conventional wisdom now holds, does want a deal, but I don't think he wants a deal at any price. And it's not clear to me that the Chinese yet are coming close enough to the bar he's set on these structural issues. I don't think just purchases is going to be anywhere near enough.
Yeah. So in the old days, back when some of us were doing this, the administration would actually have sort of a scene setter, or they would do a background briefing before a big negotiation. Is any of that stuff happening?
That'd be great, wouldn't
That would be great.
I think we saw it yesterday the closest we saw was 3 people who are
Not involved.
not directly involved in the
Directly
negotiations or involved in a secondary role step into the White House briefing room and announce something else and then take a few questions.
Right.
So no, we're dealing with a bit of a black box when it comes to USTR right now. I think that is deliberate strategy by Bob Lighthizer. I tend to, first of all, my first thing, what are you looking for? And the first thing I would do is call up a former trade negotiator and ask them what they should look for. But it is different this time around with Trump. I think when we get a deal and what kind of deal we get will depend as much on where the markets are as it will on what the Chinese are willing to give. And I think what the Chinese are willing to give will be calibrated to where the markets are and where Donald Trump is as well. After the shutdown, if I'd flown in on Saturday and as part of a Chinese mission, and I'd gone through New York and picked up the Daily News, and the headline was "Caveman" after the shutdown loss, I might have recalibrated what I would be offering at the table this week, because I would suspect that he's in a weaker position. I think there's all of these different factors at play. Which mean that this is not a normal trade negotiation. I think some of those other factors, like the market, are actually in a strange way going to restrain Bob Lighthizer in these negotiations. I think if this was NAFTA, he would be banging on the table and saying this is not acceptable, as he did a number of times. I think in the Montreal round, he kind of rejected out of hand a proposal that later became the basis of the auto rules of origin. And made some impolite noises about his Canadian hosts, but now with the markets moving on any kind of twitch in these talks, I think that changes things. I think he has the dynamic with the boss is very different. So it's really hard to know what to expect this week in a lot of ways, but we'll look for a bit of white smoke. I do tend to think everything I hear says we are at the very beginning of a negotiation rather than in the closing stages of a negotiation, when there isn't even a common document that they're talking about. And I think the Chinese also would like to extend these negotiations as long as possible, and I think that probably is what the administration will go with for a time because of the concerns over the markets.
Interesting.
Yeah, adding just to some of those points, if I think the Chinese delegation may get a meeting at the White House, possibly in the Oval. So if that happens, how much does what Trump says differ from, how Lighthizer is feeling at that moment? Because for him, this is like an opportunity of a lifetime. He was at USTR during the 80s. This is something he's been, waiting for his whole life. And one of his biggest issues are the subsidies, which is, so huge for China as well. And, how do you sort of resolve that given where Trump is and his desires, and as Shawn said, where the markets are, will be interesting to see. And the other thing I'm looking for is, I think all of us have maybe spent time in Asia, so we understand the concept of like how important it is to save face. And so much of this coverage is what the U.S. wants and what will China give them. But then what does China get? How do they spin this? How do they sell this as a win? Is it just taking off the tariffs, which they thought was unfair in the first place? So how do they also sort of sell this to their public as they are also dealing with an economic slowdown? And Xi's party, there's some grumblings about his leadership and his strategy on the trade talks. So also how they handle it and how they spin it is also something I'm looking out for.
Have you all observed how the Chinese are trying to spin this? I mean, do you have as opposed to where the U.S. is what the U.S. is trying to do?
Well, I think that the Chinese with every passing year get a little better, I think, and a little more proactive at playing the PR game. It's still not as aggressive as an American or Western institution would handle things. But when was it, a month or two ago, maybe even longer? I've lost track of time, I have to say, amid the trade war. The embassy brought all the trade reporters in for a roundtable with a think tank expert from a Beijing-based think tank that's affiliated with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and so they've gone to those lengths to try and put out the message that we're not a supplicant and we're not going to take anything and we're being unfairly treated, and in response to the U.S. indictment of our behavior, here's what we think the U.S. has done wrong. And again, the administration has been sort of all over the map because they do have this divergence of views, which in and of itself is not unique to the Trump administration. I mean, I remember all the way back to the Reagan administration when Shawn was in elementary school, and Cap Weinberger and George Shultz had very different ideas on how to approach the Soviet Union, but there was a routinized policy development process that adjudicated those differences and resulted in an agreed position. And that's what has been lacking for most of the last year, I think. So you have everybody sort of feeling free to wander on or off the reservation, getting out whatever message they think ought to be the administration's position. I think that undermines its salience.
And just to add one thing, because it just happened yesterday, I think some of the sort of non-trade issues that have to deal with rising tensions between the U.S. and China, with what we saw yesterday with the Huawei indictment. Those were, because I remember covering M&A and Huawei, because the CFIUS wasn't allowed to even do like a deal for $100 million or so, but there wasn't, a drumbeat from Justice or others, and seeing those two indictments and how thorough they were and detailed, and there's probably more to come. There's unnamed individuals who are also accused of lying to the FBI. There are questions of, whether some of them seem to refer to the actual founder of Huawei, the father of the CFO who's being detained now in Canada. So, if that happens, what do they do? Both sides are trying to say that's separate from the trade talks, but I don't know. I think if they go after the founder, can she really say, oh yeah, we get it, that's your justice system, that has nothing to do with the trade talks? I think that would be very hard given the anger that just the arrest of Meng, the CFO, has already caused in the country.
Well, I can safely say I'm glad I'm not at USTR these days. So there was a lot of discussion this morning about the Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum. Not a whole lot of discussion about, autos. How do you see all that, playing out? And how does that affect sort of other things that the administration wants to do in terms of its agenda. They're having hearings today on U.S.-UK. Where do you see all that?
Yeah.
How does that all fit together?
So, yeah, I think that's the one thing that can blow up the rest of the trade agenda, both in terms of the steel and the aluminum. I guess Brady said this morning here that if you didn't get a resolution with Canada and Mexico of the tariffs on them, that USMCA would not go to a vote, which I thought was really interesting. So I think that still hangs over that bit. On the auto side, look, I was just in Davos last week and spent a lot of time with European officials and some other folks, and it's pretty clear that is the thing that would end any chance of a deal across the Atlantic. And likewise, you talk to the Japanese, and it's pretty clear that they would not sit down. In fact, what I've heard, and I'm sure what other people have heard, is that there was a personal promise from Trump to Abe not to go ahead with auto tariffs as long as they were talking. And Abe pressed him on it a number of times. I think the Japanese, not because of that, just to back up a little bit, I think on the auto side, the Japanese may be in a better position. They seem to have a better relationship with this administration than on the EU side. But at the same time, all three are working together at the WTO. I think we should look for some kind of move on industrial subsidies launched by Japan, the EU, and the US later this year at the WTO. That's certainly what they're working towards in this trilateral framework. The Europeans are trying very hard to keep the administration working together on this stuff. But again, all of that could be blown up by the Auto 232s. I think there's one really interesting thing that has changed since this investigation was launched last year, and that's the economics of the auto industry and the broader economy as well. I think in April last year, is that right? That's the night we were at a party together and they launched the
Canadian?
The Canadian ambassador, that's right. It was poutine and silver cups. And we all had to write.
And it was very good poutine.
It was very good poutine and silver cups. It was high class poutine. But we all had to write stories that night on the launch of the investigation. And if you looked out at the auto industry at that point, it was coming off a little bit, I think, sales, but they'd come off a really good 2017. There was no, the idea that GM would lay off 14,000 people was not even in the air. The idea that China would record its first slowdown in auto sales in 20 years wasn't in the air. So I think there's a fundamental question that this administration has to ask itself, especially when it's dealing with a domestic industry that does not want these tariffs, is whether it is going to be willing to go ahead with these things to hit an industry when it's already down to a certain extent. And that would feed back into the politics in some very important states. I wonder how that'll play in Michigan or Ohio or Wisconsin, Indiana, some of those big kind of auto supply states.
Other comments, other thoughts on that? I know we have, Ken is giving me the snake eye, so I need to open the panel up to questions.
You don't get this opportunity too often to turn the tables on our trade reporters, so you have any questions?
I've spent years studying people say no comment, so I can do that too.
There's one here.
Hi, Manal from Nathan Associates. I'm actually curious to hear from the panelists what they think the narrative is going to be running up to the 2020 elections from both parties. I think they're both kind of staking out particular grounds on both ends. So after the trade deals end and we're into 2020 next year, what's the conversation like?
On trade specifically, or you? Well, I would imagine that the president's argument will be, I said I was going to make America great again, and I have done just what I promised. I got rid of all these terrible deals that my predecessors negotiated, and I renegotiated that terrible NAFTA, and now it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. It's almost as great as the deal I got in Korea, which replaced another terrible deal. And I've cracked down on China in a way no president before me has. Everybody agrees now that we had to get tougher on China. That's not what they were saying when I got to Washington. I've totally turned that around, and Xi Jinping knows I mean business, and that's why he had to come hat in hand and agree to buy, 10 more bushels of soybeans and a couple more planes from Boeing, and make promises someday in the future on market access. I mean, I think he'll just say he
succeeded.
He came through with what he said, and the Democrats will say some version of, as I said earlier, that you set the bar high, and in fact you did not deliver by your own metrics. And you haven't helped the working man and woman, the forgotten man and woman that you claim to represent. They're now suffering from the tariffs that you put in place.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a much bigger. I mean, that's a really interesting point, is if you go to Youngstown, Ohio today, which we all learned a lot about in 2016, is it in a better place than it was 2 years ago? I'm not sure that the answer to that is yes right now, especially with Lordstown next door, about to see the closure of a big GM plant there, and we all know how that plays out for a community. So I think there's going to be a lot of, on the Democratic side, there's going to be a lot of appeal to the people we were calling the left behind in 2016 and saying, has he really delivered for you? And I think there will be a lot of those people asking themselves the hard question and looking at their bank account and their paychecks and saying, possibly not. So I think that those are going to be the two narratives. And then I think at some point we may actually get trade, I think, by 2020 become a subsidiary issue. And I know no one in this room wants to hear that, but I do think there are bigger issues that command the front page already in this town. And it's getting harder for us to get on the front page again. And I think by 2020 that'll be true as well. I think one of the big questions for me is whether by 2020 there is a resolution of the kind of economic/political debate over trade. And I think the answer is probably both sides will take something away from it to say, this proves my point. The pro-tariff crowd will say, the tariffs weren't allowed to run long enough, and the Fed intervened, and so on. And the anti-tariff crowd will say, you cost lots of jobs and you cut investment because the uncertainty you created. There was you didn't get the investment growth that you should have had following the tax cuts or the tax reforms, and that means the long-term policy, the long-term future of the U.S. economy has been affected negatively for years. And they will argue about this, and there'll be academic papers, and we'll go into the future, and we'll have a similar debate, a few political cycles from now.
Yeah, I think with the midterms, we did see some of the blowback to Trump's policies, especially in some of the more Republican-leaning districts that flipped. I'm from Michigan, and several of the districts that went for Trump then went for a Democrat in the midterms. And that's a state where the tariffs were popular, at least before it really started hurting the auto industry. So does that then turn around? And a lot of it will then depend on who the Democrats actually pick as their nominee. Does the primary process allow for someone who is more moderate on the trade front to come to the fore? And how much of that, as Shawn said, will it be an issue given, there's a lot of Medicare for all and other topics that are becoming more prevalent in that debate. But who the Democrats elect, or I should say choose as their nominee, will say a lot about where trade plays in the election.
Thanks. So why don't we take two more questions together, and then I think I can give these people their schedules back. So one in the back, Mr. Phillips has already asked a question today, going once, going twice. Do we give this last question to Don Phillips? Okay, then there's a question up here, Mr. Phillips.
Thank
Please.
you. Thank you, Kyle Lawless with Ernst & Young. This is for Shawn. Shawn, you talk about trade being largely out of the headlines by 2020. I'm just really curious as to why you feel that way. It feels like this debate over globalization and globalism and the U.S.-China relationship is a long-term issue. So I'm just curious as to why you feel that way.
So before you answer, let's let Don ask his question, and then we'll...
Okay, Don Phillips again. Do you think Trump will act on his threat to issue a notification of withdrawal on NAFTA? And if he does, what impact might that have?
He always asks easy questions. You should have seen him when he was a negotiator.
So just on the trade headlines thing, I think it'll become a subsidiary headline is what I would say. I think there's bigger domestic issues for this country, whether it's the Mueller investigation, whether it's Medicare for all, the debate over that, the debates on tax policy that we've seen, even modern monetary theory now seems to be kind of taking over as the
Let me know
economic
when
debate
that makes it to the front page.
which I think is, I'm outraged about. I think trade policy is much more interesting. So I think that's why I don't think the bigger debate over globalization and so on will go away. But I also I will confess to feeling slightly contrarian in this. But I didn't feel like 2016 was. I felt like I was hearing an old debate over again, one that was played out in the 1990s in Seattle and so on. And I was in high school in the 80s, by the way. so it was, even in the 80s with Japan and the buying of the Plaza Hotel and so on. It felt very familiar to me. It felt like a rewind in 2016, and that tells me that debate is not going to go away. I think. I tend to think of, I'll make this my last point, I tend to think of globalization as a phenomenon that has been with us for thousands of years. Christianity is a product of globalization. Globalization isn't just the spread of goods, it's the spread of ideas and of people as well. I think we tend to think of globalization in our recent history and the impact, and I just don't think that's true. I'm Australian. I spent a lot of my life in Massachusetts. Massachusetts peaked as an industrial power in the 1880s and lost has basically lost manufacturing ever since then, not to China, but to other states like what we now talk about as the Rust Belt, and that was a result of the railroad and so on. So I think economic change and globalization are going to be with us forever, and we will be debating the merits of them forever, and there will be people who have easy answers to fixing all of the downsides of them forever.
So, NAFTA withdrawal?
I'll make a prediction, but only after noting the caveat that my record of predicting Donald Trump's actions is absolutely unblemished by success over the last 4 years. So take this for what it's worth. I think the threat to blow up NAFTA is like the sort of nuclear threat of invoking the shutdown, and it may be a great focusing mechanism to get people to pay attention or feel like they've got to take the extra meeting to try and get this thing going. But in my view, it would work about as well as the shutdown. And if he were to pull the trigger on that, he would own politically all the collateral damage and the endless stories of businesses, Republican and Democrat, screaming and moaning about the effect on them and their workers. So when push comes to shove, I don't think he'll do it, but I wouldn't be surprised to be wrong.
Yeah, I think, I agree with David. Not that he won't threaten it. I mean, my worry is depending on where that agreement is in the process, does it get taken hostage by some of the other things? We still have the debt ceiling. We still have another budget later this year to pass. There's, still other ways that it could get used as part of the politics on something else, and that could also be just as worrisome as another shutdown.
Last word, Shawn. What do you think?
I think anything is possible. I think it'll all depend. If it happens, it'll be a reaction to something else, and it'll be an attempt to change the agenda in a certain news cycle, and it will also be the result of someone, as happened with the steel and aluminum tariffs, by someone cleverly dropping into the Oval Office late the night before and catching the president at a particular moment and pitching him on a great idea and why the timing is right. So, and I think we've seen that playbook before, and we could see it again.
So thank you. Please join me in thanking our panelists. Good conversation.